Well, thank you for coming out this morning, your desire to come out and study His Word. Now, I first of all apologize that this is our visual aid. Recently in our household, there was a great crisis where something was spilt on a computer and there were some things lost. And I am finding out which PowerPoints were lost and which weren't. But a lot of my PowerPoint, like I had a PowerPoint for this, which was lost. So this may be a failed experience. Some of you, though it has been a great education, because some of you said you didn't know you had a board. So that way there's still some good that can come out of this. But I'll tell you what I'm going to try to do in the class today. We're going to look at some Psalms that are described, usually characterized as royal Psalms. And by royal Psalms, what we mean are Psalms that stress the human king. Now, there are another type of Psalms that are sometimes included as royal Psalms, and those are the ones that stress God is king. But we're going to focus on those that stress the human king. And there are three words which are often very prominent in these Psalms. The word David, the word king, the word anointed. Now there are some royal Psalms that don't use any of those terms, but those terms are prominent. I know David's name is mentioned in 73 of the headings of the Psalms. But I'm talking about within the Psalm itself, within the body of the Psalm that used the name David. But what we're going to do after we paint this picture of what a king was to be, what we then want to do is we want to see how Jesus fulfills this picture. I had a teacher that would often say, any list of Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in Jesus is too short if it doesn't include the whole Old Testament. Jesus fulfills the whole Old Testament. Now, it only took me a little while to learn to quote it. It will take a lifetime to fully appreciate that statement. Any list of Old Testament prophecies is too short if it doesn't include the whole Old Testament. Now, the first passage that we will go to is Psalm 45. Psalm 45. And Psalm 45 is a good one to begin with, I think, because Psalm 45 paints such an ideal picture of who the king was to be and what he was to be. In Psalm 45, in the heading for the choir director, according to Shashnanim, a maskil of the sons of Korah, a song of love. Let's particularly stress the first 7 verses. My heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. You are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor, in your majesty. In your majesty ride on victoriously for the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness. Let your right hand teach you awesome things. Your arrows are sharp. The people fall under you. Your arrows are in the heart of the king's enemy. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness. You have hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. So, in this particular passage, he describes the king. He describes the king. Now, he is painting an ideal picture. These people put a lot more hope in their king than we do our political officials today. There's a statement in Lamentations 4 and verse 20 about the king under whose shadow we hope to live. The idea of shadow is an idea of refuge, and it is sometimes used of God in His protection of His people. But the king was viewed as a protector of the people, as a defender of the people, and he was to embody all the best characteristics. Notice in verse 2 that the king is described as being fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips, therefore God has blessed you forever. Now, what is that saying about the king? Verse 2 is describing the king as being the best looking of men. The best looking of men. Have you ever thought about how rarely in the Bible you read about the physical appearance of the people involved in the stories? We don't know exactly what they look like. If their physical appearance is mentioned, it probably has something to do with the story. It inevitably has something to do with the story. For example, Eglon was a very fat man that plays a part in the story in Judges 3. You see Bathsheba was very beautiful. That plays a part in the story. But do you know the times that you most frequently see descriptions of the character's looks? I don't know this for sure, but I think you see the heaviest concentration of that when you see the descriptions of the early kings of Israel. For example, Saul was called a good-looking man, and from his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. 1 Samuel 9 and verse 2. When David is introduced, he is described as a good-looking man in 1 Samuel 16 in verse 12. You remember Absalom, who tried to take his father's throne. Absalom was a good-looking man. No man in Israel so praised for being good-looking. From his head to his feet, there was no blemish in him. 2 Samuel 14 and verse 25. And then Adonijah, who tried to take the throne of David, Adonijah was praised as a good-looking man in 1 Kings 1 and verse 6. Now, all the characters I mentioned were either kings or they tried to be kings. And it shows us in the ancient Near East, if you want to be a king, you need to look the part. And it was very important to these people that their king is an impressive looking person. Now, have we moved beyond that today? Maybe in some ways, but in some ways we haven't. Now, I know this illustration goes back a while, and I personally can't remember this. 1960, John F. Kennedy running against Richard Nixon for president. People who listened to that debate on radio said Nixon was the winner of the debate. President Nixon was the winner of the debate. People who watch it on television said President Kennedy won the debate. What's my point? My point is the appearance of the person made a difference in who you thought won the debate. And so I'm saying that we might still carry some of these ideas with us. Now, not only is the king the best looking of men, the king is also the mightiest of warriors. Look in verse 3. Gird on your sword. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and in your majesty. And in your majesty ride on victoriously. In verse 5, your arrows are sharp. The people fall under you. Your arrows are in the heart of the king's enemy. The king is the best looking of men, and the king is the strongest of men. He is the strongest of men. He is the mightiest of warriors. Remember, we want a king who will go out and fight our battles for us. The people said in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 20, we want that kind of king. And this kind of king is a mighty warrior. He is a mighty fighter. He is a powerful military figure. And not only that, notice that he fights for the most noble of causes. He doesn't fight simply for conquest, doesn't fight simply to extend his kingdom. He fights, why? In verse 4, he fights for truth, he fights for meekness, he fights for righteousness. He fights for the most noble causes. Remember the old Superman television show, that Superman fights for truth, justice, and the American way. This is the same kind of thing applied to the King of Israel. He is the ideal man, the strongest of warriors, the best looking of men. He fights for the most noble of causes, and his throne is built upon righteousness. Psalm 45, verses 6 and 7, you have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. You may remember those verses are quoted in Hebrews 1, verses 8 and 9, and applied to Jesus. But right now, we're just trying to set a picture of this king. He is the best looking of men. He is the mightiest of warriors. He fights for the most noble of causes, and his throne is built on righteousness. He does the right thing. Now, I grew up a little bit west of Nashville in Dixon, Tennessee. And to just give you an idea, my high school class had 400 graduating students in it. The class above us would have been similar to that. I don't know if it was a little more or a little less, but they would have been similar. But there was one young man in the graduating class in front of us who was clearly the best athlete. He was the best player on the baseball team. He was the quarterback on the football team. He could have played basketball and made the team as he did in earlier life, but at that time he decided to golf and do some other things. He was the best athlete. He was also the valedictorian with the best grade point average. And though personally I do not view myself a good judge of this, listening to girls talk, he was the best looking. He was also a New Testament Christian who didn't drink, didn't use drugs, was not involved with anyone sexually before marriage. Because I grew up with him, I think I failed to appreciate how unique that was. But how many times do you see somebody who embodies all of those things? How many times do you see that? let me speak as a proud father for just a second. All my 3 kids were that in their high school graduating class. Of course, it was easier for them because they were homeschooled and the only one in the class. But they got to live that fantasy. Forgive that sarcastic remark. But how often would a person embody all of this? So, but this is the ideal for a king, okay? Let's go to another passage, Psalm 2. Psalm 2, as we're talking about the human king in the Old Testament. And in Psalm 2, the Psalm says, "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth took their stand. The rulers took counsel together against the Lord, against His anointed. Let us tear their fetters apart and cast their cords asunder. He who sits in the heavens will laugh. The Lord scoffs at them. He will speak to them in His anger and terrify them in His fury, saying, but as for me, I have installed my king upon Zion, my holy hill. I will surely tell of the decree of the Lord, and He will say to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance, and the very ends of the earth as your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall shatter them like earthenware." Now we're going to highlight verse 7 in just a moment. Notice that this text speaks of God's anointed in verse 2. It speaks of the king in verse 6. We said these are often characteristics of these royal psalms. They speak of the anointed. They speak of the king. But here, I will tell of the decree of the Lord, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Psalm 2 tells us that that the king is to be in a father-son relationship with God. I will be to him a father. He will be to me a son. That language is from 2 Samuel 7:14 in the covenant with David. I will be to him a father. He will be to me a son. And here he says, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And this Son of God, who will rule as King of God's people, is going to exercise, according to verses 8 and 9, he is going to exercise worldwide dominion. Worldwide dominion. Ask of me, and I will give the nations as your inheritance, and the ends of the earth as your possessions. Now, I'm going to ask a question. And by the way, this can be a class. If you want to speak, you're welcome to. But I'm going to warn you before I ask. It's a trick question. Okay. So you may want to be careful. At what point in Israel's history were they the mightiest nation on earth? At what point? Now, if you don't want to say anything, that's fine. But I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are saying David and Solomon. David and Solomon was the closest it ever came to worldwide dominion, but still, they were not as powerful. David and Solomon were not as powerful as the kings of Assyria would be later, as the kings of Babylon would be for 70 years, as the kings of Persia and Greece would be. It's not that they exercised that. What I'm stressing, There was never a time in Israel's history where they exercised this kind of worldwide dominion. Now be thinking about that. Keep that in your mind. We want to come back to that. But the king is to be in a special relationship with God. The king is to be a son of God. God is his father, and he's going to exercise worldwide dominion. Now, let's go to another psalm and see what it says about the kings of Israel and Judah. And this is Psalm 72. Psalm 72. Psalm 72 is one of the two psalms in the book of Psalms that are attributed to Solomon. Psalm 72. Now, one of the things that Psalm 72 does, Psalm 72 again speaks of the king's worldwide dominion. Look at verses 8 through 11. May he rule from sea to sea, from river to the ends of the earth. Let the nomads of the desert bow before him, and his enemies lick the dust. Let the kings of Tarshish and of the islands bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts. And let all kings bow down before him, and all nations serve him. The same kind of thing we saw promised in Psalm 2. Ask of me, and I'll give you the nations as your inheritance. We see it here in Psalm 72. He's ruling from sea to sea, from river to the ends of the earth. Worldwide dominion. But I'll tell you the thing that stands out to me the most in Psalm 72 is not just the king's worldwide dominion, but it emphasizes that this king is one who will do righteousness and justice. Righteousness and justice. In verses 1 through 4, give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's sons. May he judge the people with righteousness, and your afflicted with justice. Let the king bring peace to the peoples, and the hills in righteousness. May he vindicate the afflicted of the people, and save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor. Romans 13, verses 3 and 4, 1 Peter 2, verses 13 through 17, emphasize that the king is to punish the wrongdoer, to praise the one who does well. This passage is very close to that idea. The king is doing righteousness. He treats others right. He does justice. He acts with holiness. David is said to do justice and righteousness in 2 Samuel 8:15. Solomon in 1 Kings 10, verse 9. And Josiah is said to do justice and righteousness in Jeremiah 22:15 and 16. But they are the exception rather than the rule. This is rare that a king practices these qualities. Look at verse 12. He will deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also when he has no helper. He will have compassion on the poor and needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. He will rescue their lives from oppression and violence, and their blood will be precious in his sight. The kings of Assyria were the most powerful ones in the world from about 745 to around 626 BC. The kings of Assyria, in their monuments that have survived, boasted of their cruelty. They boasted of how many they killed, of how many they burned alive, of how many they buried alive within walls and then built walls around them. Those kings boasted of their might and their destruction and their violence. The kings of Judah are called to show mercy and compassion to the weakest, to the poor, and to the needy. Now, we already said that none of these kings of Israel and Judah, none of them exercised worldwide dominion. How many of them live up to the ideal of doing justice and righteousness? You remember Saul, David, and Solomon were king over the divided kingdom. Or excuse me, the united kingdom. United kingdom. Then the kingdom divided. Rehoboam was king of Judah. Jeroboam was king of Israel. Now, one of the easiest questions I ever asked in a test, and would ask it repeatedly to give people a good, simple chance to get at least one question right. How many kings of Israel were good? How many kings of Israel after the division of the kingdom and Jeroboam is king of Israel and Rehoboam is king of Judah, how many kings of Israel were good? And all God's children answer, none. None of them were good. You might think you might back into one good king, but no, none of these kings were good. But even in Judah, where they had the promises to David, all the kings that ruled except Athaliah were from the line of David. In the land of Judah, you had the temple, you had the priest and the tribe of Levi, you had all these things, and being a good king was an exception and not the rule. You have really good kings in Hezekiah and Josiah. You have pretty good kings in Asa and Jehoshaphat, and you have a few others that are somewhat good, but not all that great. Joash, Amaziah, and Uzziah, and Jotham. This is my point, okay? These words are recorded, but their kings are not living up to this ideal, are they? They're not living up to this ideal. And I will tell you a passage that ultimately confronts this head on is Psalm 89. The first 18 verses of Psalm 89 are in praise to God. They extol Him, they exalt Him, they praise Him. Psalm 89. A key word in that psalm, two key words in Psalm 89 are the words loving kindness and faithfulness. They are both used 7 times in the psalm, loving kindness and faithfulness. And God's loving kindness and faithfulness are praised, particularly as He demonstrated it in the covenant to David. In verse 3, you see that idea, verses 1 through 3. So verses 1 through 18 are praise. Verses 19 through 37 of Psalm 89, these verses describe God's covenant with David. And it expresses some of the ideas that we've already seen in Psalm 45, Psalm 2, and Psalm 72. It expresses some of the same kind of ideas. For example, the text emphasizes this king will have worldwide dominion, and he will be in a father-son relationship with God. For example, let's begin in verse 24. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him, and in my name his horn will be exalted. And I will also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the river. He's going to rule over all of this. I'm going to set his hand on the sea, his right hand on the rivers. He will cry to me, you are my Father, my God and the rock of my salvation, and I shall also make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. I will be to him a father. He will be to me a son, Psalm 2 and verse 7. I will make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. This focuses on many of these promises we've already seen emphasized, and it stresses to us that the king, God's promises to the king, are of all these things. This special relationship, this worldwide dominion. But that's not how Psalm 89 ends. Psalm 89, verses 38 through 52, these verses stress, to paraphrase it, God, what happened to your promises to David? You promised us universal dominion. We have been beaten. We have been oppressed. We have been defeated by every foe we faced. In verse 42, you exalted the right hand of his adversaries. You made all his enemies rejoice. The king in verse 38 and 39 was rejected. He was, in verse 39, his crown was profaned in the dust. In verse 40, you've broken all his walls. In other words, all these promises you make of dominion to the king, they failed. Now, you remember the story of the kings in Samuel and Kings and Chronicles. Do you remember what happened to the last king of Judah? The last king of Judah was named Zedekiah, whose name means the Lord is righteous. Jeremiah preached to him. He said, surrender to the Babylonians. He said, I'm afraid to. Zedekiah didn't humble himself before the word of the Lord through Jeremiah. As a result, when the Babylonians broke down the walls of Jerusalem, and they eventually caught Zedekiah, who tried to escape to Jericho, they brought him to Nebuchadnezzar. The last thing Zedekiah ever sees is his children slaughtered before his eyes as he's helpless to do anything. And then they blind him. They put out his eyes. And people that have been blinded in circumstances like that say the last thing they ever saw leaves an indelible impression on their mind. And so constantly in his mind was the death of his sons, and that he is blind and he can't see and he can't care for himself. And that is the king that God said would be the strongest and best looking and mightiest. This is the kind of king that God said, I'll be to him a father and he'll be to me a son. This is the kind of king that was told he would exercise worldwide dominion. God, what happened to your promises to David? As it's asked in verse 49, where are your former loving kindnesses, O Lord, which you have sworn to David in faithfulness? We said those words, loving kindness and faithfulness, were the two key words of Psalm 89, both of them used 7 times. But the final question is, God, what happened to your loving kindness and faithfulness? I want to tell you what we should get from Psalm 89. Is it okay if I come down? Yeah, okay. And I want you to think about this. And I hope this encourages you and helps you. Any time in history that we live, we're not able to see the whole big picture. And it may look to us at times like God's promises have failed. And when it seems that way, just wait, just hold on, because God will ultimately make sense of it all. Zedekiah was the last king of Judah in 587 BC. They don't have a king. They don't have a king. But it led to, these passages remained in their Bible, as well as several prophetic texts that said the same kind of things. And it built hope in the hearts of the Jewish people for a coming king, a coming anointed, a coming son of David, who would fulfill all these promises. And the first verse of the New Testament says, Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why mention that he was the son of David? Because those promises God made to David, that he would have a son that would reign upon his throne. Those promises he made to David in 2 Samuel 7 are alive and well in spite of appearances. Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew's gospel will call Jesus the son of David about 8 or 9 times. Again, God promised David, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. That was fulfilled in David's relationship with God. But that's true in a deeper level of Jesus' relationship with God than it had ever been of David. You know that statement, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Part of that was quoted when Jesus is baptized by John in the Jordan River in Matthew 3, 16 and 17. Part of that is quoted on the Mount of Transfiguration when Peter says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And a voice appeared, a cloud appeared, and a voice spoke, this is my son, my beloved son. Listen to him. My point, all throughout the life of Jesus, these Psalms are referenced, alluded to emphasize that these promises that God made to David are being fulfilled in Jesus. But many of the people, they longed for a king like David who delivered them from the Philistines. They longed for a king who would deliver them from the Assyrians or the Babylonians, or as in Jesus' day, they longed for a king who would deliver them from the Romans. Now I say this as one who has been blessed to live in this country. But the political oppressors of history come and go. They disappear. They are not our ultimate problem. And again, I'm blessed to not have lived under that kind of thing. But they come and go. But do you know the ultimate enemies of man? The ultimate enemies of man are not Assyria. They're not Babylon. They are not Rome, but they are sin and death. And Jesus is coming to deliver us from the greatest of foes. He has come to deliver us not from just specific examples of how human governments go awry, but Jesus has come to deliver us from our root problem of sin, to bring forgiveness and death, to give us eternal life. And Jesus exercises worldwide dominion. Remember when he told his apostles in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, all authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. That's universal dominion. All authority has been given to me in heaven and earth. Go therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. For lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. Jesus exercises worldwide dominion. Now, I'm not saying right now it's all that it will be, because there will be a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord to the glory of God. Philippians 2, verses 9 through 11. I'm not saying His rule is all that it's going to be, because one day there's not going to be any question in anybody's mind. But He does exercise worldwide dominion. Follow me just a second. When Saul is about to become king of Israel, when the people come to Samuel and they say, give us a king who will go before us and who will fight our battles. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, Samuel says, okay, but I want you to know the kind of king you're going to have. He's going to take from you continually. He's going to take from you. He's going to take. He's going to take. He's going to take. He's going to take your sons. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take your best workers. He's going to take. And one day, you're going to cry out for relief from the king you have, and I'm not going to listen. Now, that's true of the kings of Israel. Okay? That's true of the ones that should have been the best of kings. That's how they lived. Let's go to the book of Esther. King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. You remember when his wife doesn't do what he says? He doesn't come for him when he says to come. He puts her away. And when he's looking for a new queen, he gathers every attractive young lady in the land of Persia and brings them in to see who will be the new queen. He would bring the woman in for a night, and then she could only come back into his presence if he called for her by name. But I want you to understand something, and you probably already do. When this woman had come into the king for a night, she didn't, if she was never called for again, didn't go out to live happily ever after and marry and have a nice family. She was in the king's harem and could never marry anybody else or be with anybody else. And the king didn't just treat women badly. I want some of you women to feel good about this. He wasn't a sexist. He was an equal opportunity abuser. And that should make us all feel better. Because many young men every year were castrated and brought into the king's service. But this is my point. If you were in the land of Persia in the time of Xerxes, the king wasn't there to serve you. You were there to serve him. Now contrast the kind of king Samuel described in 1 Samuel 8, the kind of king Ahasuerus is in the book of Esther. Contrast them with our king and how Jesus fulfilled these. He was God, not subject to death, not subject to suffering. He was God, and he entered the arena of human history to live as a man. And as he was God living as man, he sometimes became hungry, he sometimes became thirsty, he sometimes wept. When his disciples got into a dispute, who is the greatest in the kingdom? And can I have positions at your right and your left in your kingdom? Jesus called them to himself. And he said, my kingdom is not like kingdoms of the world. You aren't considered great because of how many people serve you, but how many people you serve. And he said, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. The point is, this king is one you can absolutely trust. Because he's not simply using you to get more pleasure. This king is one who went through great suffering for your good, for you to experience forgiveness of sins, for you to experience eternal life with God. In pointing out Old Testament prophecies fulfilled in Jesus, any list is too short if it doesn't include the whole Old Testament. And these Old Testament passages about the King should have built in their hearts a hope, a longing, a desire for this ultimate King who would bring them deliverance from the greatest of all foes, sin and death. Thank you for your attention. Warren, would you want to lead us in prayer?